Hi, and welcome to SAMCAST, a production of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. I'm Bob Humphrey, your host, and with me, my co-host is David Trahan, the Executive Director of SAM.
Well, not that you aren't a handsome devil, Bob, but what's with the sunglasses?
David, I'm glad you asked. Today's topic is solar power. Now, you might think that the sun is an unlimited source of free energy, but if you're not careful, you might get burned. And that's what we're going to talk about. I think most people probably are at least in favor of the theory of renewable, safe energy, but we have to be real careful about the potential costs as opposed to balanced costs and benefits. So we're going to talk about that, and I understand you have a little parable that you'd like to share
Sure.
before we get into the meat of this.
I want to tell a little story because if you don't learn from history, then you're doomed to repeat it. And for those that are old enough, probably our age, can remember when Maine had, I believe, 11 pulp mills, and the forest products industry was massive across northern Maine. Well, when I was a kid, most of the discharge from those paper mills and from our septic systems ended up going into our rivers. And in the early 1970s, people recognized you couldn't do that. You can't dump raw sewage and sludge from these mills into our rivers, and they passed the Clean Water Act, which is viewed as one of the most significant environmental regulations in American history. The part that isn't told, though, is that the powers that be, the political powers, the people who influenced behind the scenes, took the sludge out of the rivers, but they promoted spreading it on the fields. And that happened for about 50 years. There were chemicals in this sludge. A lot of it went right back into the rivers, and it polluted a lot of places with PFAS contamination. And I believe that solar is another issue that warrants more thought as to its impacts 20, 30, and 40 years out. If we don't learn from the Clean Water Act, then we could be doing significant damage to our environment and not even realize it. And that is the impacts of solar, particularly the heat that it generates.
Well, we're going to get to that. Let's not get ahead.
That's what I wanted to just
the moral of the story
this
is
lesson.
that the road to disaster is paved with good intentions.
Correct.
Real quick, let's give us an idea of the scale. What size amount of development is in place and on the way in the very near future?
Sure. DEP told me that most of the smaller arrays in the 20 to 40 acre variety in southern Maine, pretty much we're done with those. What's happening next is there's a new renewable power line going into Aroostook County, and that's going to be to bring wind power down, but also solar. And that most of the projects will be much larger than that, in the hundreds of acres. We've seen
How many hundreds?
Well, in Farmington, there's a 500 acre one. Just recently, in the town of Hersey, which is just above Patton, there's a proposal for a 5,000 acre.
5,000 acres.
5,000 acres. That's like a little over, a fourth of a township. That's a big solar farm.
Okay, so supposedly solar's a good idea. Let's go with that, but let's look at what are some of the potential pitfalls?
Sure.
We'll start with land use and habitat loss.
Sure. 2 years ago, we worked with other outdoor groups, conservation groups, to require mitigation of wildlife habitat when developing solar. That bill passed. That was to affect things like impacts on deer wintering area, significant wildlife habitat, that sort of thing. So the solar farms, now they have to mitigate for that. Unfortunately, the solar industry's been dragging their feet, and we still don't have rules to implement that. So that's still in progress. And then this year we submitted a bill to regulate or do research on the heat generated by solar arrays. Now this is where I think, I know because the governor's office has reached out to me and said, we want to change what you've brought out for a problem.
Save the heat thing for last.
Okay, all right.
No heat yet.
No, keep in mind,
We're looking at fencing, fragmentation,
yes.
Just the quality of habitat that's created as opposed to what was there before.
That's right. You call them solar arrays, but they're really, they're just a utility, basically a utility, much like any other utility that generates electricity. They're a commercial industry. They create a massive network on the landscape. A lot of people say they don't like looking at them, but they're really just an energy generating factory, and they call them solar farms. Now, let's get to the fences. I brought this issue up both on the radio and in the legislature. Most people were looking at the panels, not at the fences. That's an impediment to wildlife corridors. The governor said several times to me and to others that when they put the 500-acre farm in Farmington, the deer in the wintertime, as they're traveling to their deer yard, could no longer travel through their normal corridors. They had to go down the streets in Farmington, literally down the streets of Farmington to get to their wintering area.
And that's a relatively small scale. I did a little research on this myself, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has actually published some information out west where there's really big arrays. It's a significant impact to migrating wildlife, elk,
Yes.
bison, pronghorn.
In places like Africa, where there are massive farms that are fenced, some of the species are going extinct because they can't get to their normal watering areas. So if you put up a massive fence around a farm, these animals have to travel further, and they dehydrate and die before they get to their traditional watering holes. So it's having a massive impact, not just in Maine, but around the world.
And I use this argument when people talk about a plant-based diet versus eating meat. You take 5,000 acres of prime wildlife habitat where you could have deer, grouse, bears, turkeys in perpetuity. You know, they would live there forever, generation after generation. We could go in and take a few and eat them. Or you could go in there and you could cut down every tree, root it up, and plant it in soybeans. Well, these things aren't even going to have soybeans. It's just grass. Another thing that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said is serious habitat degradation. In some cases, the introduction of chemicals like herbicides, grading, which results in siltation and runoff. And what you're left with is basically a field that might support a few grasshoppers and a few small mammals. But most of the wildlife has been displaced forever.
That's right. Because I know you want to talk about the heat generated by solar rays, but an unknown fact is that when you clear the ground cover, the tree cover, the shrubs, and you put in solar, it increases the surface water temperature by up to 14 degrees. So before you even bring in a solar panel, once you've cleared the land, you've already heated the groundwater. That's on the surface.
And it's a hard, flat surface.
Well, some are.
Just like a shopping mall. If you build a shopping mall, and you have to have a parking lot, you have to have a drainage plan, you have to have water retention ponds and underground runoff.
Stormwater runoff plan.
Yeah.
Right.
So other things that people might not think about, and these are things that are pointed out by federal wildlife agencies: bird collisions with solar panels and transmission lines. They see these things that look like water from the air. So you get marine or aquatic birds that fly in, try to land. Now they can't get a picture of a loon inside one of these enclosures. It needs water to take off. What else have I got here? Mortality evaporation ponds, which are, it's a quagmire of toxic substances. Could result in introduction of alien species, both plant and animal, especially plant. You've got heavy equipment coming in there from who knows where, and the next thing you know, you've got Phragmites grass, you've got honeysuckle, you've got barberry, all these things that we don't want because they just take over.
Right, that's right. Well, the thing about solar is, if you can put it in a field that's already been cleared, the overhead is reduced. It's a lot cheaper to put them in fields, particularly in the places that we grow our food. In southern Maine, I think that's one of the big frustrations. And I know that farmers, especially the associations that represent them, are very concerned that we're putting solar in our fields, the very places we need to grow our food.
Well, yeah, and that's another really good point, because the two don't necessarily go well together. You can get away with, I think, wind farms a lot more easily and still have some agriculture.
You don't have
That
fences.
doesn't
You
happen.
don't have fences around solar. I mean, around wind power either.
No.
You know, some people may not like the wind power, the wind turbines, but you're not keeping all the wildlife out. That's one positive to that.
All right, so let's get to the biggie now.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, just creating this bare ground space has already raised the temperature, and there's a fair amount of research that shows. What I found is in a standard conventional array, so photovoltaic array, anywhere, it raises the temperature to the point where it's equivalent to a desert. This is at night. The nighttime temperature is equivalent to a desert.
That's right.
So,
yeah, so I've been doing research on this since we did our build 2 years ago, and I looked at the heat generated by solar panels. Solar panels during a hot summer day get as hot as 150 degrees. To understand how hot that is, you can cook your breakfast on it. You can have your bacon and eggs cooked on this solar panel when it gets to that temperature. The reason they get so hot is that they're not a very efficient way of making electricity. So a solar panel might only be 25% efficient, which means the rest of the energy it absorbs has to go somewhere. It's either held in the panel, the structure, or it dissipates back into the air. And some research has been done, and what they found is that these solar arrays create what's called a heat island. And the air temperatures around them can be as much as 5 to 7 degrees warmer in the air around them. Now,
which doesn't sound like much, but
it is, because it goes to show you how much heat is being generated. There's up between 1,500 and 2,000 solar panels per acre. So 500-acre solar array, you can do the math, it's what, a million panels or something like that? So there's a lot of them. And if they get to 150 degrees, I said to myself, these things are awfully close to water bodies. So I started doing some research. I called Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I found out that their recommendations for solar siting, which struck me as odd because they created their own shoreland zoning regulations. You can't build next to a body of water without going through a lot of hoops with DEP. These solar panels were being sited 25 feet from a water body, and so I did the research and found out that there are only recommendations from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They aren't even in rules or statute. So these solar...
So we think this is a good idea, but nobody's bound by rule of law to
and they're negotiating with DEP on these to get them even closer. So
it sounds like deer yards in the old days.
Yeah. Well, for me, when you've got the amount of heat being generated up to 7 degrees warmer just in the air around them, what is happening in a late August day when it's 95 degrees and we get an inch and a half of rain and a thunderstorm? So I called Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and DEP and said, hey, I've got some real concerns here. And so what I found from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife was that in a solar array, when you clear and put one in, because these panels intercept both sun and water, meaning rain, it changes the way the water runs off, and it accelerates it 11 times. So this inch and a half of rain comes down out of the sky, hits these panels at 140 degrees, let's say. Water's got to go somewhere, and it's going to go somewhere 11 times faster. So
let me stop you right there. Hold that
Okay.
thought and be ready to continue.
Yeah.
We have some pretty strict timber harvesting practices designed for just that reason, to protect the natural resources that are adjacent to these sites. So,
Yes, exactly. Under the Forest Practices Act, as a former logger, if I wanted to do a 500-acre clear cut, I have some incredible, I can't do it. You can get exceptions, but you have to go through hoops. But there's always
there's a good reason for them.
That's right.
And it doesn't apply to solar.
That's right. In some cases, depending on where you are, the setbacks can be 100 feet, it can be 250 feet, depending on the resources that are there. Now, how did these solar arrays, am I the only one who figured out they were getting hot during the day and this possibly could heat up the water? I don't think so. But they were negotiating them right up to the edges of these wetlands. And so now with this corridor going into northern Maine, that's the last remaining unbroken brook trout habitat, naturally reproducing brook trout habitat in the United States.
Heritage waters.
Heritage
State
waters.
heritage waters.
Cold water fisheries that are susceptible to water temperature.
Extremely susceptible to warm water in the summer.
Yeah. So my real concern starts with brook trout, but it's the canary in the coal mine. If you're getting too close to these last remaining brook trout strongholds, and you don't have any real data, and that's the other thing. Their recommendations I asked with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is not based on data. It's just we think it's our opinion
Just a
that
feel-good.
a feel good thing. So there's a good I think path going forward with the governor's office, and I just had a discussion this morning, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But my point is that when you go north, we don't have the flat lands like we have here in southern Maine. They put this corridor into Aroostook County. A lot of the places they'll be putting them will be steep. They'll be coming because they'll be aligning with wind tower development up there. They'll want to be close to those because
So that's only going to exacerbate the runoff.
it's going to make it worse. These solar arrays will be close to these wind towers. Wind towers are on mountains for a reason. That's where the wind is.
Mm-hmm.
So these solar arrays will be close by. That steep land, the amount of heat being generated will be going right into these cold water streams, brook trout. The Hersey site scared me when I looked at it. I looked at an aerial map of this 5,000 acres they're proposing, and it is riddled with brook trout streams, with small brooks, large brooks, intermittent streams. Now, if your concern is the same as mine about the impact it would have on the fisheries, what is happening to all the other wildlife? When you have an intermittent stream, it means there's water there part of the year. There's things that are living there that if you put hot water into those intermittent streams, it's going to kill them as well. And it's going to end up in that brook trout.
It'll affect the whole food chain.
Yeah. And keep in mind, the hottest time of the year, the water levels in these streams is very low.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these trout are packed in small pools. There's a reason you can't fish on them, because they're concentrated in these small pools late in the season. When I looked at that, I gave testimony in the Energy Committee. I was shocked because League of Conservation Voters got up and testified against the bill. In their testimony, the core of it was, we have a global warming problem, and that if they don't want to test for the data, basically because they believe the worldwide crisis is more important than what's on the ground. That frightened me when I heard that, because they're not truly advocating for the environment when they say we don't want to know what's going on in something as important as this.
Yeah, it's a little bit like offshore wind.
Mm.
We had, we would have the occasional marine mammals stranding, and then until they started construction, seismic testing, and then all of a sudden, whales, dolphins, and porpoises are washing up on beaches all up and down the Atlantic coast en masse. But that's okay, because it's for a good cause.
Well, no, it isn't. I said to the committee, because I was asked a question around this, why would environmentalists oppose this? They're so committed to the world ending someday soon if we don't get global warming under control, that they're looking away while other things they should be looking. So what I'm getting at is it's not one or the other. You can have both. You can have safe and reasonable setbacks and appropriate places to put this. But if the very groups whose own mission is to protect this resource are looking the other way, then you're in trouble, because there's no longer an advocate for the natural resources. This same group, League of Conservation Voters, they have a position that is dedicated to promoting solar development and offshore wind. Some leaders of groups like Audubon have now gone to work for solar developers. They're too intermingled. There's a real conflict there. You can't have both. You can't both have environmental protections and unregulated development. And that's the problem. So SAM is filling that role. We will continue to advocate for these natural resources. Now, getting to the call I had with the governor's office this morning, the committee said blatantly, right in the meeting, we want some mandatory setbacks. He's right. We got to do something. Sam's right. And so in discussions, I think this is what's coming forward. The governor will promote and will pass, or will work with the committee to pass a mandatory setback. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife will conduct research on a half a dozen sites or so and report back on where the appropriate setback should be, so that in 2 years we can go back and adjust them a second time to get them away from these streams.
Is there a funding source for that research right now?
I said yes. I said to the governor's office, whatever it takes, we're going to do this. We are in the process of passing a $5 increase in the fishing license. Some of that money's set aside for research. Some of that money could be used. We got the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund.
Okay, but wait. We're the fishermen, we're the hunters. We don't want this stuff. We want wildlife habitat and clear, cold trout streams. Why do we have to pay for the research? Why not the people who are impacting the resource? Why don't they have to pay?
I think they should, but it's a serious conflict when you've got the environmentalists and the developers together. I'm a little bit nervous with them having anything to do with the research. I told you
No,
that
they just write a check to the department.
they won't do it. We had that discussion
That
this
should be
morning
part
with
of
the
their
governor's
mitigation.
office. Well, it should be, and in the future it likely will be, but they are not going to pay to be told that they're way too close to these places and you got to move back. Getting back to the funding source, if the legislature doesn't find a funding source, shame on them, because this issue that now that it's been brought up could be impacting endangered species.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these places they're putting them are right on Atlantic salmon streams and rivers. There are other endangered species that are close by. If they're cooking those endangered species, they've opened themselves up to a massive endangered species lawsuit. And there are groups out there that'll do it. So either correct this right now, or going forward, we're going to push this thing right to the wall. We have to.
Because that's what Sam does. We're
That's
out
right.
there for you folks.
That's right. That's right. Getting back, just one last thing about solar. There's one of the frustrations that I have is solar belongs in places, in my opinion, like contaminated PFAS fields,
Perfect.
old abandoned gravel pits.
Highway medians.
Yes, there are certainly places that solar belongs, and I have no issues with that. But this idea of driving by those very places solar should be, along with the already developed infrastructure, to go into wild places in northern Maine.
Well, at the same time, we're trying to conserve deer wintering areas in Aroostook County.
That's right. That's the part that frustrates me the most. Is there's a push on, and I think once the new administration's in, if these solar subsidies dry up, but that's only temporary. One administration goes to another, and they change their policies, and we need to protect resources for the next 50 to 100 years. And that's why this has to be addressed right now, because unlike what they did in the early 1970s with the Clean Water Act, we're not looking away while they spread the same sludge they said was poison in our rivers on our fields where we grow our food to go right back into the river.
A lot of good points there. A lot of good material. Food for thought, that's for sure. So I guess the bottom line is if you're going to go out in the sun, make sure you have your sunglasses.
That's right. Well, I think this is one of the more important podcasts we'll do. The solar panels, like you said, that are out there, there's a lot of impacts that haven't been addressed, and we can't race to a global warming solution. This may be a small part of it, but solar is not the end game. It can't be.
Well, thanks, David, for all. That's like I said, a lot of eye-opening information for sure. We hope you enjoyed this edition of SAMCAST. Send us your comments via social media, and if you have any more ideas for future casts, by all means, send them our way, and we'll try to get some folks on here to tell you about interesting parts of fish, wildlife, and natural resources conservation in the state of Maine.
I'd like to add one more thing. For anyone who likes what the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine is doing, you can join the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine by going to sportsmansallianceofmaine.org and joining. Make a donation or buy a raffle ticket and support us. Thank you.